This lecture and the next two lectures are on Chapter 15. The title is Public Finance and Public Choice. And so at this point in the course, we've covered the core of microeconomics theory. So with that background, now what we're going to do is look to some specific areas. And today we're looking at government, or the public sector. And economists have approached the study of government in a couple of ways. One, the more traditional approach is public finance. And so this looks at ways of collecting tax revenue and different types of taxes and what are the optimal taxes and so on. A more recent approach to studying government that economists have taken is called public choice. And as the name suggests, this approach studies how politicians and other political actors, like bureaucrats and so on, actually make decisions. Traditionally, economists and others, when studying the choices politicians and others make, have assumed that the politicians act to maximize social welfare or to maximize the social good. But economists realize that this assumption is inconsistent with the assumption that we make about consumers and producers. So for example, we assume consumers act to maximize what? Their utility, right? Or their happiness. And firms act to maximize profit. So why do we assume that politicians are not self-interested? So economists realize we need to change that. And let's assume that politicians are no better and no worse than anyone else in the economy. That is, they're going to act to maximize their self-interest. We're going to start with public finance and then move towards public choice in this chapter. And this first part of this chapter 15, we look at the role of government in the market economy and some of the rationales for government. A lot of this discussion is fairly descriptive. For example, here we have a figure showing government expenditures and revenues as a percent of GDP. And I should define for you what is GDP. This stands for Gross Domestic Product. In a macroeconomics class, you'll study in detail what gross domestic product is, how it's calculated, and so on. But for the purposes of this class, you only really need to know that it's a measure of the nation's total income. So if you add up the income of every individual in the nation, you get gross domestic product. And so GDP reflects the total amount produced or earned by people in the economy. Okay, so what this figure is showing is the fraction of government expenditures and revenues as a percent of GDP. And so in the early part of the last century, government was quite small, right? Only around 10% of the total spending in the economy was carried out by governments. We notice here in 1940s, there was a massive increase in government spending. And why was that? World War II was really, really expensive. And it mobilized the entire economy, and we spent a lot of money on weaponry and so on for the war. After the war, that fell down, but we see it's risen over time. Well, I'll let you read the details about these descriptive features of government. But I wanted to spend most of my time in this lecture talking about the rationale for government rather than these details that you can just read for yourself. And so here, the book says, to understand the role of government, it will be useful to distinguish four broad types of government activities. The first one are government attempts to respond to market failure. Second, government encourage or discourage consumption of certain goods and services. Third, the government redistributes income. For example, programs such as welfare and Social Security redistribute income from higher income to lower income households, or from working households to retired households. And then the fourth activity that governments undertake are policies to influence economic activity. And this is a macroeconomic policy. For example, during a recession, the government might engage in some stimulus spending, a term you probably have heard over the last few years as we're coming out of the Great Recession. We're not going to talk about these policies in this class. It is, of course, an important role for government, and not only the government in the traditional sense that we've been talking about, but also the Federal Reserve Bank has a big role to play in policies related to macroeconomic conditions. And I know many of you are very interested in those topics, but that's topics for a macroeconomics class. So here we'll talk about these first three. Okay, first, responding to market failure. We've studied several situations where markets may fail to achieve the socially efficient level of exchange. And so what are some examples of that? We saw there were public goods. And the public goods, what's the problem with public goods? There's a free rider problem. We also talked about goods that have external costs, like pollution. We've also looked at imperfect competition. So for example, if there's a monopoly, we see that there is not enough of the good exchange. So now we'll look at all three of these situations. Again, we're looking at rationales for government. How might the government respond in the case of market failures? Well, first, with respect to public goods, in the last lecture, we looked at a public good problem through the lens of game theory. And you might recall we had the following game. We had two players, player 1 and player 2, and each of them could contribute to the public good or not. And so, for short, I'll just say C or NC. And the payoffs for the players were as follows. The payoff for the players are as shown here. And I have a whole lecture that explains why the payoffs are like this. But basically the idea is if both players contribute $1 to the public fund, then that public fund is able to produce more than $1 of benefits. In particular, it's multiplied by 1.5, so there's $3 to split. I'll let you watch that video to remind you of this. But what was the dominant strategy equilibrium to this game? It turns out the dominant strategy for both players is to not contribute. Even though both players would be better off if both contributed. But because each individual acts in their own self-interest, we wind up in this situation. And so this is the market failure. This is an illustration of the free rider problem that's associated with public goods. So one rationale for government is to force the players to contribute through taxation, right? Force them to pay a tax, in other words, to contribute, and then both players will be better off. So this is not a demand and supply analysis, it's a game theoretic analysis. But nonetheless, it's a model that illustrates the problems with public goods and that provides a rationale for government. Okay, next we have external costs and benefits. And here we will use supply and demand diagrams to illustrate the problems. So for example, I'm going to take some liberties and not label the axes to make this a little bit prettier. But if we have an external cost, for example, pollution emitted through the production process of something, then effectively the costs are higher, therefore the supply curve is higher. You'll recall that what is the supply curve? Where does it come from? As we saw in chapters on production cost, it's the portion of the firm's marginal cost curve that lies above average variable cost. But if there are social costs to production, for example, people are breathing in this pollution, that's a cost. In fact, the costs are higher and the supply curve should be higher. But firms in this market won't take those costs into account if they're not forced to. Remember, they're interested in maximizing profit. So they will exchange this quantity. But in fact, the socially efficient quantity to exchange is this green quantity. And so governments then might take actions to regulate firms so that they will take into account these costs associated with production. Now, we can also analyze external benefits in the same exact way, except there, the problem isn't that we're producing too much, but rather not enough. And so here we have the demand and supply. reflecting the private benefits and costs. But if there are external benefits, and the example we'll consider later is a vaccination program. So if you are vaccinated for some disease, you benefit from that, right? Because you're not going to get that disease. But there's also an external benefit, because the more people that are vaccinated, the less likely these diseases are to be spread throughout society, right? And so this could be represented as the social demand curve being higher. And so again, we have a situation where the market produces where this red dot is, but it should be producing where this green dot is, roughly. So notice the difference. With external costs, the market's producing too much, right? Here we have the quantity is too much. We want to be at the green quantity, we're at the red quantity. But with external benefits, the market's not producing enough. We're producing here, but we want to be here. There's one third area, and this is imperfect competition. For example, monopoly. And we studied this fairly recently, so it should be pretty fresh in your mind. How do we analyze a monopoly? Well, we have the demand curve, but because the monopolist is a price maker, it sets its own price based on where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And so in other words, it picks this quantity. The firm produces this quantity, but society would prefer that we produce here. In other words, we could maximize social welfare if we produced the quantity associated with this green dot rather than the quantity associated with the red dot. And so here we have on one page all of the graphs that I've shown, only we also illustrate the deadweight loss associated with it. So let me first talk about the external costs. As I mentioned, the external costs mean the social costs are higher than the private costs. But we're producing too much. So the deadweight loss is this area here, right? It's the fact that here the costs associated with this quantity of output are this area. But the benefits are only this area. So the costs are greater than the benefits for those units of output between QO, it looks like, and QN. In other words, these are the costs. This whole area I've just circled in are the costs, but the benefits are only this area. And so the difference is that purple area shaded in as deadweight loss. Likewise, or similarly, for external benefits, you have a situation where we're producing here. But because the social benefit curve is this one, we're actually receiving this much benefit. And so the costs are less than that, right? The costs are just here. And so we should be producing more. We should be producing to the point where marginal benefit equals marginal cost, which is right here. And at that point, we have these benefits, and these are the costs. And so again, the difference is this purple area, what we call deadweight loss. And in this case, the deadweight loss is the net benefits we could have received if we would be producing the efficient output level. With respect to monopoly, we just covered that, so I won't spend time to review it. This is the deadweight loss. And then the first figure here, they illustrate public goods with just a demand and supply diagram. So I use the game theoretic model to illustrate the free rider problem. The free rider problem showed that we didn't contribute enough, right? We didn't get enough provision. So similarly to the situation of external benefits, we should be producing more, but we're not. We're producing less. And so the deadweight loss is the difference in net benefits from what we could have received if we produced the efficient level from what we're actually receiving from producing a little bit. Even with the free rider problem, there will usually be a little bit of provision. But this illustrates that not nearly enough. The book refers to some goods as merit and demerit goods. Merit goods, they refer to as goods that some individuals in government or some governments think should be provided, even though they're not clearly public goods. For example, symphony orchestras. Are those public goods? Not really. Remember the characteristics of public goods. Non-excludable and non-rival. Can you exclude someone from sitting in the symphony hall? Yes. Is it rival? Yes. If one person sits in that seat, no one else can sit in that seat. So those are not public goods any more than movie theaters are public goods. Yet we don't see movie theaters subsidized by governments, but we do see symphony orchestras sometimes subsidized by orchestras. And so why is that? Well, for whatever reason, justified or not, remember, public choice theory would suggest that governments don't always act in the social welfare. For whatever reason, the governments thought they should subsidize symphonies because maybe they think that there wouldn't be enough of it provided otherwise. But we don't know exactly why there's not enough, right? It's people don't demand it. And then what about demerit goods? Well, maybe situations like smoking or drinking. Politicians have decided that we shouldn't be doing that as much, so we're going to tax that. It's not clearly a negative externality, although you could also make these arguments, for example, for taxing alcohol on external cost basis. Sometimes we call external costs negative externalities and external benefits positive externalities. So I realized I slipped in that terminology without defining it for you. But why? Why could alcohol consumption lead to external costs? Well, if people drink and then drive, that could cause someone on the road to be injured or killed, right? That's an external cost, and that is a result of alcohol consumption. So there is some justification for taxing alcohol based on negative externality rationales. But you might just say that some people have a moral objection to alcohol consumption, and so therefore they tax it for that reason. In that case, they're saying it's a demerit good. They may not use that language, but this is what the language the book is using. Okay, and finally we have income redistribution. Earlier in the course we looked at situations where markets maximize efficiency. But this is given some distribution of income. And the initial distribution of income may not be very attractive to some people. So there's an argument for redistributing income along those lines. There's also a public goods argument for redistribution in the sense that when someone is very poor, for example, imagine homeless people, when we see them on the streets, we feel bad. And so if we can somehow get them off the streets, we'll feel better, right? But that's a public good in the sense that everybody feels better when they're off the streets. And so how are we going to get them off the streets? Will we rely on private charity? There might be a free rider problem there, right? We would all like to see them off the streets, but none of us want to pay for them to get off the streets. So again, it could be called income redistribution when we give money to low-income families. But you could also say that it's providing public goods. In any case, these are some of the main activities that governments are involved in and some of the rationales for government. And that's the main point of this section.